All right, we're going to start the final session of the workshop. No, I'm getting a nod, there's something else afterwards. It's the final session, right? Yeah, okay. Final session of what's been a fantastic workshop from my perspective. Again, hello everyone, I'm Richard Levy, leader of Theme 3 and co-lead of Theme 3, sorry Sophie. And this session is one in which we're really lucky to have some presentations from some, what I'm expecting to be excellent speakers, no pressure, where we're going to hear a little bit more about how we can tell our story, the story we have to tell that we've heard, how important it is, the messages, the stories, the information that we have, how important those stories are, and how do we get them across to others, to communities, to a broad range of people in a way that's accessible, I guess. So that's the goal of the next session is to explore that topic. We've got 4 presenters this afternoon, and we're going to start with Rebecca Priestley.
Thank you, Richard. First, I'll just start by introducing myself and kind of talk about who I am and how I fit in here. So like many of you, my undergraduate degree's in geology, but I then did postgraduate study in history of science and creative writing. So I write non-fiction books, mostly with a history of science focus, and to me, history is everything that happened up to yesterday, as well as essays and articles with a real focus on climate change, Antarctica, and sea level rise. So I've worked closely with Richard Levy and Tim Nash over the years, and on one of my 3 trips to Antarctica, I joined them at a remote field camp and wrote about it in my book, 15 Million Years in Antarctica. So I look forward to talking about this sort of storytelling when we're all meeting together in the panel. And I also collaborate with natural scientists, social scientists, and other humanities scholars on questions around public engagement with climate science, sea level rise, Antarctica. And as part of the NZ Sea Rise program, which was led by Tim and Richard, I collaborated with a social scientist to survey the New Zealand public about their understanding of sea level rise. And more recently, I was part of a multi-author paper about the NZ Sea Rise program. And my PhD student, Zoe, has got a poster about our public engagement work. Also chair of the Instant HASS subcommittee, which is part of Theme 3. So HASS in New Zealand is the most popular avocado brand. Is that the same here or where you live? Yeah. Okay, so I'm not talking about avocados. I'm talking about humanities and social sciences. And just broadly, our goals are to facilitate exchange between humanities and social science scholars interested in the Antarctic ice sheets and sea level rise, and to identify and progress group research projects, both within the HASS community and with the wider Instant research community. So to the topic of this talk. First, I want to acknowledge that we're doing a good job. I know a lot of people here have been really involved in communicating about climate change, about Antarctic ice melt and sea level rise, and the impact of climate change on communities around the globe. And this message has made a difference. And here's just a few people whose work I know about, and I know that lots of other people here are involved in this sort of work as well. So we have passed some thresholds here. Climate change denial has been decreasing over the last decade. Media coverage of climate change has increased and it's become more accurate. More than 130 countries have net zero pledges, and the recent global stocktake even showed that 20 countries' carbon emissions have peaked and are now on a downward trend. This graph in the green and blue shows some research by Pew Research Centre across 17 countries that showed that more than 70% of respondents were concerned that climate change would harm them personally over their lifetimes. And more importantly, 80% of them were willing to make changes to reduce the effects of climate change. So that's all good. But CO2 levels are still rising. So things might be a whole lot worse if we hadn't put so much effort into communicating about climate change, but they could be a whole lot better. And I think 20 years ago, when I started writing about Antarctica and climate change, we might have thought that if we had this level of acceptance that climate change was happening, we might have seen a whole lot more action. So while there are now still climate change deniers, they are in a minority, and they're mostly politically motivated. So the real challenges now are the delay on meaningful action on climate change and the sense of doom that a lot of people have. This idea that the future is already written and there's not much that we can do about it. So what we need to focus on now is the need for urgent action. It's not so much about convincing people of the science as the need to act now and the fact that we can make a difference. So from my humanities perspective, I could say that while there's still uncertainties, we know that the ice sheets are melting. We know that human activities are to blame, and we need a lot more focus on getting people to take this seriously, to adapt to what's coming and try and stop things getting worse than what we're already committed to. And yet here we've got a conference heavily dominated by natural scientists with only a handful of HAS researchers here. And that's a no-blame statement. It's just a reflection of how things are. And one of the reasons is there was a big HAS conference in Lisbon earlier this year, and it's hard for people to come all the way to Europe twice in 1 year. So my humanities and social sciences colleagues often get asked questions like these. And some of these sorts of questions came up yesterday. Why is the response of the policy world so slow? How do we let people know their actions will make a difference? How do we communicate a sense of urgency without inducing climate anxiety? And how do we know if our communication efforts are working? And so on. And when I'm asked questions like this, I often find it quite overwhelming. Just taking one of those questions, how do we best use our science to affect climate change action at pace and scale? It's a really huge question, because we're talking about a global system in which there are 8.1 billion people, 195 different sovereign states, hundreds of thousands of large companies. So you could think of this as, there are billions of individual actors, variables, data points, each with agency. This is a very complex system. And reality, what we need to do is break things down into smaller communities and look at their values, their needs, their pressures, and try and communicate with and engage with them on a much smaller scale. But with these big questions, I find myself thinking, because I think about ice a lot, like everyone here, that this question is kind of the tip of an iceberg. So there's a lot of research out there that could contribute to this question. We can't study the entire complex system, but we can use proxies, like representative samples and case studies and longitudinal studies. And there are different fields within the humanities and social sciences that can contribute here, including psychology, media studies, cultural studies, political science, public engagement with science, and more. And when I was thinking about this, I thought it's kind of like the big question here that this conference is mostly concerned about, is how much and how fast is the Antarctic ice sheet going to melt? So to put it into one tidy question, how much sea level rise will Antarctic ice melt contribute by 2100? And that's a huge question, and you will know this. We're able to answer that question as best we can because of a whole lot of data that's been collected over decades that we've been hearing about this week. And then, and I know this is a really simplistic view, you can feed the data from these studies into models run on supercomputers. And you can put the models together like an ISMIP and see what that says. And this is really possible through decades of research, billions of dollars of research funding all up, and a culture of working in large international multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary teams. And we don't have that in the humanities and social sciences. So the academic study of science communication and public engagement with science is relatively new, and it's really just coalescing into an academic field or discipline. And this sort of research also doesn't attract a lot of research funding. I know that everyone's pressed for research funding here, but the humanities are actually being decimated in many universities around the world. And we also don't have such a tradition of working in large teams. And we don't have a model. We have many individual studies that could inform this question, but nothing really to bring them all together or test how changing one or more variables might impact on the answer to this question. So what I'm trying to express is that trying to answer a question like this, which is the sort of thing that I get asked, is really challenging. Because there's not really a global community. There are lots of national, regional, local communities with different concerns, values, needs, and problems. And different modes of communication or public engagement will be needed depending on what you want to talk about or who you're going to be talking with. And we touched on that a bit in our workshop yesterday. There are some best practice communication guidelines around, but right now best practice is just not cutting it. So we need to do more and better and different. So while I can't answer those big questions, I can talk about some thresholds and instabilities associated with the questions, and maybe how we can think about responding to climate change action delay and climate doomism. First is some good news. When you're talking about convincing people to take meaningful action on climate change or to understand that it's worth making an effort, we don't need to convince everyone. If we can get 25% of a community on board, research shows there will be a social tipping point. And that's because us humans have a tendency to want to conform with social norms. So changing social norms can drive rapid social change. And one way we can help move towards these desirable thresholds is by making our private behaviours to combat climate change more visible. So that might mean talking about your transport choices, your food choices, which businesses you do or don't support, who you vote for, your involvement in activism. And it also suggests that those of us with connections should be working to recruit the 1%, the billionaires, to change their behaviours, because it would be really impactful to see some social tipping points happening within that global community. But while it can be good news that we only need 25% of people on board for social change, there are alternative news media, lobbyists, PR companies and online bots, all working against whatever message we're giving. So they are trying to move the public towards some different thresholds or tipping points. So disinformation is part of the political and communication landscape today in a way that we've not seen before. This was acknowledged by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in their annual Doomsday Clock statement at the beginning of this year, and it's been acknowledged by individual governments, including in a recent report by the New Zealand Security Intelligence Service, and it's increasingly the subject of academic study. So just to have an example that's close to home for me, last year, as the culmination of 5 years' work, the NZ Sea Rise Programme released sea level rise projections for the entire coastline of New Zealand for points every 2 kilometres along the coast, and taking vertical land movement into account, as well as projected sea level rise. We had a tightly coordinated communications and media strategy, and media analysis showed that we had 235 unique media stories, which is good for New Zealand. A focus on local impacts, so different coverage in different parts of the country, and the media coverage was realistic rather than sensationalist. So we could say that that was a success. But there was immediate online pushback against our messages, and the people who a couple of years ago were complaining or campaigning against science about COVID were now taking issue with our sea level rise projections. They were using words and phrases like climatards and climate fraud, fake climate fear, and worse. And these are phrases that are used internationally as well. There was also a suspected denial of service attack, which led to the online map that launched the information being unavailable for several hours on launch day. But this in itself became a media story and gave us additional publicity. And here's a more recent example. In February this year, weather forecasters warned of very heavy rains that were likely to cause flooding across parts of the North Island, leading to closures of schools, libraries, roads, rail networks, and advice to stay home. And this led to accusations of climate lockdowns. And here's how the hosts of New Zealand's #1 commercial radio station responded. So these aren't fringe social media posters. This is mainstream media, describing the reaction to the forecast as paranoid, hysterical, fear-mongering, and controlling. So the storm was as bad as forecast. Lives were surely saved by the preemptive actions that were taken, but even so, 11 people died, thousands of people were displaced, and the storm caused billions of dollars of damage. The Disinformation Project in New Zealand, a research group, said earlier this year that in New Zealand, COVID conspiracy theorists have made a strategic and sophisticated switch to spreading anti-climate change messages. And this is just an example of something that's happening around the world. And it's something we need to be aware of in our communications. That depending on what media they consume, the people we are communicating with might also be getting some alternative media messages that are specifically designed to undermine everything that we're saying about the need for climate action. And just to make things a bit more gnarly, there's also a trend for people working in academia, journalism, and public life to be harassed. So here's a very recent example of a US TV meteorologist who got death threats after linking the extreme weather he was forecasting and reporting to the climate crisis. So I've got colleagues in New Zealand who've been harassed, receiving rape threats and death threats for being public spokespeople about COVID-19 during the pandemic. People had some very strong feelings about things like vaccine mandates and lockdowns, and now action on climate change is being seen by some people in a similar way as a form of government control. And as part of their pushback, we're likely to see climate scientists targeted, and too often it's likely to disproportionately be women and people of colour who get this sort of harassment. So it's a very different landscape that we're working in today than we were pre-pandemic. There was still lobbying against climate change action then, but it's got a whole lot nastier and more personal than it used to be. So I think we need to be aware of it, be more honest and open about it, talk to each other about it if it happens. And one thing you can do is to lobby your institution to be aware of these issues and support staff as best they could. So rather than this being an instability or a threshold, I think this is an opportunity. And Patrick Flam touched on this on day 2. So far within this community, HAS researchers and natural scientists are not really working together. And it's worth noting that as we move towards doing that, that there is quite a big cultural divide here. So just to document a few things, as I said, in the humanities and social sciences, humanities mostly, we don't have a culture of large team projects. So in my discipline, the most prestigious output is a single author book, and after that, a single author paper or essay. HAS researchers are very poorly funded, even more poorly funded than science, and often feel marginalised. And part of this is the constant institutional threat of HAS units being dismantled, and that is happening around the world. And we're also subject to misconceptions. For example, social science is not the same as humanities. Humanities is not the same as the arts. Studying something is not the same as doing something. So there's a difference between researchers and service providers or practitioners. But if we want to answer some of these gnarly questions, we need to work together. And because it's really hard for HAS researchers to access research funding on their own, the best chance of getting HAS researchers working on Antarctic problems is as part of large interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary groups. If you want to reach out to Antarctic HAS researchers, you can reach people through me or through the SCAR Action Group on public engagement with Antarctic research, or even through the HAS Standing Committee, and all those contact details are on the SCAR website. But before reaching out to HAS researchers, I'd encourage you to be clear about whether you want a research partner, a collaborator, or a service provider, a communications professional. And I'm talking specifically here about public engagement related work, because that's part of what I do, but this can apply to stakeholder engagement, translating science into policy advice, and anything else related to humans rather than ice sheets. So I'm just going to give some examples here on projects that I've either been involved in myself or that people have asked me to be involved in. So here, advice on a communication strategy plan or best practice. If that's the sort of thing that you're wanting, then there are communications professionals who can help with that if you have some money to contract them. Evaluating success of an Antarctic outreach effort is also something that people ask about a lot. That could kind of be either way. If you can find a researcher whose field is evaluation, that's something they're really interested in doing, they might want to use your project as a case study and then publish, but you'd want to get them involved very early on, preferably before you start planning the outreach. Writing a book about melting Antarctic ice sheets and the scientists who study it, that's what I'm doing. That is my new project that I'm just starting. That's over on the research side, that's completely driven by me. But equally, if you had a project and were wanting to commission a writer to write about it with a specific brief, you could contract a communications professional to do that. Surveying public understanding of ice melt and sea level rise, that's something we did as part of the NZ Sea Rise project, and we were able to do that, and we published the results in a paper in PLOS One. It's also possible to contract a company to do a survey for you if it's specifically related to something that you want to use that to inform your communications. I'm nearly done. If it is how much time have I got, Richard? Okay, if it's a research partner that you want, I would encourage you to be open to maybe doing things differently. Let the humanities and social sciences help drive the research direction. I think that we're good at working in multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary teams, but maybe if we want to answer those gnarly questions, we need to go even further into some transdisciplinary research. So this is an illustration that my PhD student Jo Bailey made when coming to grips with the literature for her research project on science communication. So as you moved from cross-disciplinary to transdisciplinary, the individual ingredients or disciplines become less discernible until finally you've transformed all the ingredients into something new, a cake, which is yummier than just a plate of carrots. So it would be good, when we have time, if we could sit down with some of these big questions and think about which disciplines could contribute and see how we could all work together in new ways. And that's what we started to talk to a bit in our workshop yesterday. And now I just want to say that while it'd be great to have this new ideal and to start doing transdisciplinary research, there's no time to wait for this to happen. So please do keep communicating through multiple channels and to multiple audiences. It's worth noting that trust in politicians and journalists is waning, while trust in scientists is still relatively high. Normalising climate conversations, discussing climate change can lead to greater acceptance of the science and what we need to do about it. And it's better to provoke people to be angry about the lack of climate action than anxious. Anger leads to activism, and anxiety is likely to lead to inaction. And I'll just leave this up on the screen to close. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Look, at really, really strong and clear thoughts and messages and ideas in that presentation. So thanks a lot, and we'll have a chance to ask Rebecca some questions during the panel discussion after the presentations. So on that, I'd like to invite our next speaker, Aimee Kaio, to the stage.
Buongiorno, kia ora, hello. I te mea tuatahi, tēnei te mihi ki ngā atua me ngā tangata whenua o te Trieste, o Italia hoki mo o Tino Manaki, kai te mihi ki a koutou mo o mihi kua mahia. So firstly, I greet the people of Trieste and Italy for the fabulous Manaki, the fabulous care that we've all received during our time here at conference. I te mea tuarua. Tēnei te mihi ki ngā kaiwhakawā o tēnei wānanga mo o mihi kua mihia. So next, I thank the organisers and presenters for the thoughtful and meaningful greetings and hosting of us all. I te mea tuatoru, aku mihi ki ngā kai kōrero o ngā wāhanga nei, aku tino mihi ki a koutou mo o mahi whakaro, mahi rangahau, mahi a mātauranga tonu. So a very special greeting to you all. It's an honour and great pleasure to be in your presence. Your insights, your ideas, your research is so important, and I applaud you and encourage you all to continue on this transformative mahi. So, ko wai au, who am I? He uri ahau no Ngai Tahu Te Arawa me Ngāpuhi Hoki, so I am of Māori descent. I come from New Zealand. My tribes are Ngāpuhi, Te Arawa and Ngai Tahu. So Ngāpuhi is from the top of the North Island. Te Arawa is the middle of the North Island. Oh, I could use this wee there. And Ngai Tahu is the larger region down the bottom there. Now, I live right down the bottom, not the bottom island, that's Stewart Island, Rakiura. I live right at the bottom, which is Bluff or Motu Pohue. Born and raised there, we are a 6th generation family still living there. Beautiful place, freezing cold, so I have been sweating a lot during this conference. I currently work for my tribe, Te Runango Ngaitahu. I just started a new role as the Research and Innovation Director, so we're looking at setting up a research and innovation sector to support the aspirations of iwi going forward. Prior to this, I was in investment and strategy for our tribe. I'm also part of a group called the Kāhui Māori, and our role here is to support our New Zealand national science programs with their cultural confidence, integration, communication and capability build aspirations. And I'm currently the co-chair of the Kāhui for the New Zealand Antarctic Science Platform. So that's a picture of Bluff in our harbour, and this is our marae. So if you are ever in my area, please make contact. I would love to host you on our marae. So today, tēnei kōrero, this talk. So, disclosure, this week in New Zealand is Māori Language Week, so I'm kind of incorporating it here in a global sense. So tēnei kōrero means this talk. A very good colleague of mine, Professor Sandy Morrison from Waikato University, her and I conducted a research project in 2020 and 2021 called Te Tai Uka Apia. So I'm going to talk about that research project because it's linked very closely with storytelling and the importance of storytelling to our people. So those are the 3 key points that I want to talk to today. So all through the kōrero you will note and hear and hopefully experience the connection and communication pathways that resonate with us as Māori. So firstly, to set the scene and set the context of who are Māori and who are Ngaitahu. So Māori are the Indigenous peoples of New Zealand. New Zealand has a shorter human history than any other country. The date of first settlement is a matter of debate, but current understanding is that the first arrivals came from East Polynesia between 1250 and 1300 AD. It was not until 1642 that Europeans became aware that the country even existed. The original Polynesian settlers discovered the country on deliberate voyages of exploration, navigating by making use of prevailing winds and ocean currents and observing the stars. The navigator credited in many of our traditions with discovering New Zealand is Kupe, and sometime later the first small groups arrived from Polynesia, and they are now known as Māori. So today I'm focusing on my tribal area of Ngaitahu. We have resided in this land for 800 plus years. So in terms of being an Indigenous people, we're relatively new. And we have a tribal population currently of 75,000 members. So Ngaitahu were the first tribe in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to settle historical grievances with the Crown. This feat took 7 generations, and in 1998, Ngaitahu claim was settled, which included a transfer of a range of assets, resources and tools which forged the next stage of our tribal journey to preserve our identity. Now, part of the resources includes tribal rights and interests of the subantarctic islands, the surrounding southern ocean. So, Ngaitahu whānui, we have, I keep using Māori words, Ngaitahu people, we have a range of long-standing cultural and commercial interests in the Southern Ocean, and connections with Antarctica, while not as deep, are also many and varied and of increasing importance to both Ngaitahu and our New Zealand government. My uncle uses this quote quite often. that we are an Indigenous people and we are a tribe that will never die. Therefore, our tribal strategies are intergenerational. We know our environment and conditions will change over time, but we are very clear that our cultural values of whakapapa, our understanding of interconnectivity, and kaitiakitanga, our duty as guardians and stewards, this will never weaken or change. Therefore, we see our role today as being a significant influencer and decision maker on all things related to our region and our people. As New Zealand Government and Ngāi Tahu treaty partners, it is important that we work together, especially on critical matters such as climate change. We as a people, we ask ourselves daily, are we being a good ancestor? And are our actions and decisions today reflective of the future we aspire for next generations? Okay, so that's the context of New Zealand, of Māori and of Ngāi Tahu. I hope you're still with me. Now I'm going to touch on mātauranga Māori. So mātauranga Māori literally translates to mean Māori knowledge. So we refer to mātauranga Māori as our Indigenous knowledge system. This is how we view the key aspects of mātauranga Māori. This is how we view and live in the world, and this is how we connect to place. So mātauranga includes our traditions, values, concepts, philosophies, and our worldview, and we express this in many different ways. So our cultural narratives and mātauranga are deeply entwined in our rich history, our worldview, our values and traditions, and key aspects of this are based on whakapapa, so genealogy and connection to ancestral lineage, links to rangi and papa, so Sky Father and Earth Mother, and whakapapa also connects us to past, present and future. We have creation stories, so these stories often involve ancestral beings and describe the formation of land, mountains, rivers and other natural features. Oral traditions and storytelling, these play a vital role in preserving our cultural narratives and passing down of knowledge from generation to generation. These stories include historical accounts, legends, myths, and teachings about the natural world, spirituality, and human relationships. Connection to whenua and moana, ki uta ki tai. So in our worldview, everything is connected. So there's a strong physical and spiritual connection from mountain to sea and everything in between. We view all of our lands and waters as living beings, and Ngāi Tahu tribal people, we are kaitiaki or guardians of these lands and waters. Tikanga, these are our protocols, so our cultural customs, and tikanga guides our social and decision-making processes. Te reo, our language. Our language carries the wisdom, stories and expressions of our ancestors. Our language revitalisation is an integral part of our growth as Ngāi Tahu people. And resource management. So Ngāi Tahu, we have a deep understanding of natural resources and sustainable practices. Our mātauranga includes knowledge about the environment, observations of weather and the seasons, animal behaviours, flora and fauna life cycles, and most importantly, our traditional harvesting practices. So all of these aspects and concepts make us think about how we care for our lands, our waters and our people. It's important to note that Ngāi Tahu's cultural narratives and mātauranga, they are dynamic and they continue to evolve. As the tribe engages with contemporary issues and adapts to modern society while still honouring our ancestral traditions. So this is why our narratives and mātauranga are important to us. Are we all still on the waka? Have I lost anybody yet? Okay, cool. Got one thumbs up. Right, now, back to Te Tai Uka Apia. So if you Google Te Tai Uka Apia and story map, it will take you through a beautiful story map of the research program, but also the cultural narratives and mātauranga woven throughout that project. So if you're keen, please look that up. So Sandy and I, we set out on a mission to create a space for Māori to engage with, to deepen their understanding of climate change, adaptation and planning. We sought to inspire curiosity, to inspire interest, and bring to life our Māori relationships, our associations, our connections with the Deep South. We wanted to show our New Zealand connectivity and relationships with and to Antarctica and the Southern Oceans, communicated in such a way is to make Antarctica and the Southern Ocean accessible to Māori, to Pākehā, to young and old alike. We sought to demonstrate that the health of Antarctica and Southern Ocean are a critical part of our future and show a pathway how we, as good ancestors, can demonstrate guardianship to the fullest extent possible. We draw on the richness of dual knowledge systems, science and mātauranga, recognising that points of intersection between knowledge systems can be a space for building relationships, shared understandings, learnings and innovation. We emphasise that dual knowledge systems should not be forced, but rather to be recognised that knowledge systems can and do intersect, diverge and run alongside each other with equal validity. Science and mātauranga both consider elements of the Earth systems individually and collectively, with an inherent understanding of the value in knowing the total system, the parts, and the interconnectivities between them. Climate change is a complex and systemic problem, and effective influence and responses to managing future impacts must be built on an understanding of interdependencies, influence, feedback loops, consequences, and action. And what better way to do that than all together? This picture down here is a picture taken after one of our wānanga or one of our workshops. So we were fortunate to interview a number of tribal members of all ages, and we were presented with a range of historical narratives and documents and interesting questions from our youth, all to contribute to Te Tai Uka Apia. So we focused on two mytho-historical figures in Māoridom, so Tamariri and Hui Te Rangiora. So this is a Māori artist's impression of Tamariri and Hui Te Rangiora. They were actually part of an artist's installation at the top of Bluff Hill, and so that hill in the background is part of Stewart Island. So yeah, I wish I had pictures of it from down the bottom of the hill. It looked quite impactful, and this was a really good way to connect our community with connection of our mytho-historical figures that we look up to and that we know well, and connecting us to the Southern Ocean and Antarctica. So the title for this research, Te Tai Uka Apia, it reflects the description of icebergs Hui Te Rangiora gave when he returned from the Southern Ocean exploration. So the sea, Te Tai, and foams is uka, and pia is like arrowroot that you get from the Pacific Islands. So hence the name Te Tai Uka Apia. The Hui Te Rangiora and Tamariri stories in association with Antarctica and Southern Oceans are remarkable stories of voyaging into the Southern Oceans at a time when humans journeying that far would have been extremely small in number, even if they had lived to relay the tale. It has been Western explorers and later Western scientists who have been credited with exploration and discoveries in this area. Yet there are our own narratives relating to voyaging, which took place long before many of the Western explorers and which are still held by our tribal people as part of their tribal law. I've got 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes. Okay. As the research project developed and socialisation of it grew, so did the interest and awareness of our Māori communities, which range from young people to kapahaka groups, to wakaama groups, to families, environmental groups, business, and marae communities. It became clear that making visible the relationships Māori had with the Antarctica and Southern Oceans was serving as a powerful conduit to engage with climate change awareness, climate change education, and future thinking and planning of adaptation and mitigation strategies. So if you want to really get into the detail of Tamariri, the story, please go to the story map. This is just an example of how we've used the storytelling of Tamariri as a climate change hero. So storybooks were published. They are now throughout New Zealand schools. This is our beautiful Baba Thompson, who just passed away a few months ago, who retold this narrative. And the biggest thing that we heard from families were Tamariri as a starting point for discussion about climate change. This kōrero embeds whānau in the changing landscape, and whānau are now empowered to act. So Ngaitahu and the floating white islands of ice. So Ngaitahu, we have our own names for the features of the Antarctic region based on our historical narratives. So we have the Southern Alps here on the left. We refer to them as ka tiri tiri o te moana. And this means the glistening, the steep peaks of glistening white. And then we have Antarctica, which we refer to as ka tiri o te moana. Yes, these are an extension. There is an extension and connection from the Southern Alps, which runs underneath the ocean, which we call Te Ara Akiwa, which is Whaiwau Strait, and then Te Moana Tāpokopoko o Tāwhaki, which is the Southern Ocean. So they're all interconnected, and I'm conscious of time, so I won't go into why they are called those names, but they are our historical names for those places. Te kai whakatere o te raki. This is another expression of how we connect with place. So this is the po that is down in Antarctica, standing at Scott Base. And this was unveiled in 2013, and it was installed to maintain our mana moana, so our sovereignty over that area in a cultural sense, not getting into treaty things, and to reflect our tribal status and history of the Deep South. So the head of Te Kai Whakatere, it looks straight up to the sky as a symbol of celestial navigation, and all of the carvings throughout the po are quite stunning and depict and represent everything within the Antarctica takiwā. This is also in our story map. So this is a very good example of dual knowledge systems working together. So mutton birding is a traditional practice of ours. I think this practice started as early as the 17th century. Yes, we have our own tribal ownership of the islands. So it's a bit hard to see, but there are, so these islands, some of them here, there's some little ones around here, and also these ones up here. They're all mutton bird islands. So every year for around 2 months, between April and May, hundreds of our families go to their beneficial islands, and they harvest mutton birds. So this is just a depiction of how we used to preserve mutton birds when we caught them. So you've got a bull kelp sack that's blown up and dried, and then covered in tōtara bark and a woven basket to protect them, and now we use buckets. It's innovation. So just highlighting the dual knowledge systems coming together, we entered into a 15-year research project with the University of Otago as the main lead, and it was called Kia mau te titi mo ake tonu atu, and it was to understand why do we have a decline in these species. Here we learnt the migratory patterns of titi, which you see here. The blue is their feeding grounds. So lots of weather observations, sea behaviour observations. So we had quite a few families that handed over their journals and documented oral histories of their observations over generations for those areas and during that practice. And then we have whare rawora, which was the utilisation of the whole bird. So understanding the properties, such as omega-3s, anti-inflammatory properties, I was going to say antidepressant, but anti-inflammatory properties, the feathers, all of it. So that's been an excellent project as well. And all of that still continues, and we work very closely with science institutions and individuals to support us in our management plans of those islands. Just one more. So I hope you got to hear throughout the presentation of how connection to place and our worldview is very important to our understanding of why Antarctica matters and why the Southern Oceans matter. How we communicate is a lot through our arts. So our marae, this building on the left, it's very colourful, it's got a lot of artwork in there, but it tells the entire story from creation to the food basket and ecosystems that we have in our region. And then in the main meeting house on the right, it depicts all of our whakapapa, the lands, the oceans, the waterways, that connects us all to that place. So there's a lot of stories to be told in that house about the Southern Ocean and Antarctica, and also around climate change adaptation. So these are the key learnings from here. So we really encourage a holistic approach to the environment. There is real magic in connecting dual knowledge systems, strong voices, influencers of change, drivers of action. There is power in storytelling and power in connecting mind, heart and earth, and recognising connection and communication conduits are critical to enabling a collective call to action. So Kaio mātou ringaringa, tō mātou a pōpō, many hands need to come together for a better future. So our uncertain but shared future requires shared efforts. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Aimee, ngā mihi nui. There'll be time afterwards during the panel again for you to ask Aimee questions, hopefully provoke some thoughts